Today, we're tackling some really compelling, frankly, quite intense material. We're diving into Naomi Klein's 2008 book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It's her look at this pattern she identified, how major crises, disasters, wars, economic collapses, how they become these surprising moments for really radical economic change. Okay, so let's just jump right in. Klein lays out these two big ideas right at the start: disaster capitalism and the shock doctrine. What exactly is she getting at with these terms? How do they work in the real world, according to her?
Right. Well, what's fascinating and maybe a bit disturbing is how she defines disaster capitalism. It's not just chaos. She sees it as orchestrated raids on the public sphere, happening right after some catastrophe hits.
Yeah.
And it's not just about rebuilding. It's about treating the disaster itself as a kind of market opportunity, almost exciting from a certain perspective.
A market opportunity.
Well, a strategic exploitation. And this connects, Klein argues, directly to an idea from Milton Friedman, the economist. She calls his tactic the shock doctrine. Friedman basically observed that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. That was his view.
So crises are necessary for change.
According to Friedman, yes. And the key, he believed, was to act incredibly fast when a crisis hits. You impose rapid, irreversible changes before society kind of snaps back to normal, before it returns to what he called the tyranny of the status quo.
The tyranny of the status quo.
Right. He even put a time frame on it, suggesting a new government has maybe 6 to 9 months to push through major changes. A bit like Machiavelli's advice, inflict injuries all at once.
Get it over with quickly.
Exactly. So Klein says these Friedman followers, the Friedmanites, they essentially keep these free market policies ready, like stockpiled, just waiting for the right crisis moment to deploy them.
Okay, so I think I'm getting it. It's not just that bad things happen and then people react. Klein is saying there's a playbook, that crises are actively seen as these windows, maybe like a blank slate moment, to push through a pre-planned agenda, often without real public debate.
That's the core of her argument, yes.
Yeah.
It reframes crisis from just bad luck to a calculated opportunity.
So how does that theory, the shock doctrine, actually turn into policy? What's the shock treatment she talks about?
Well, it translates into a very specific package, a rapid-fire economic transformation. Klein lists them: big tax cuts, aggressive free trade deals, massive privatization of state services, deep cuts to social spending, and widespread deregulation.
A whole suite of changes.
A whole suite, yeah. And Friedman himself called this economic shock treatment. He knew it was painful. The idea, Klein argues, is that the initial shock of the crisis disorients people, making them less able to resist these fundamental economic shifts that might otherwise be really unpopular.
It's about the speed then, overwhelming the capacity to respond.
Speed is crucial. It's designed to prevent organized opposition from forming.
Okay, that's clear. So where does Klein say this strategy was first really honed? She points to Chile in the mid-70s as a key laboratory. Tell us about Allende's government and what happened next.
Absolutely. So Salvador Allende was democratically elected in 1970. His government aimed to bring key sectors like copper mining, banking into state control, a socialist agenda.
Which wouldn't have sat well with certain interests.
Exactly, especially U.S. corporate interests. And the source material's pretty explicit here. President Nixon apparently told the CIA director, quote, "Make the economy scream."
Wow. Directly ordering economic destabilization.
That's what the sources suggest. And it wasn't just government. Corporations like ITT were apparently deeply involved, even drafting an 18-point plan that specifically called for a military coup. It mentions getting to reliable sources within the Chilean military to, quote, bring about necessity of his removal.
So the crisis was, in part, engineered.
Klein argues it was actively stoked, yes.
Yeah.
Setting the stage.
And then came the coup. General Pinochet, a really brutal period. How did Friedman's ideas and his followers fit into that upheaval?
Pinochet's coup was incredibly violent, and Chile was already suffering from severe hyperinflation. So you had this perfect storm, the kind of crisis Friedman talked about, ideal conditions for radical change. Friedman advised Pinochet on this rapid economic transformation, things like replacing public schools with voucher systems. It became known as the Chicago School Revolution because many of Pinochet's key economists, the Chicago Boys, had studied under Friedman at the University of Chicago.
Ah, the Chicago Boys. I've heard that term.
Yes. And the Brick. That was the nickname for their huge 500-page economic program. It was the detailed blueprint, and remarkably, Klein notes 8 of its 10 main authors were Chicago alumni.
So it wasn't improvised. It was a prepackaged plan ready to go.
Ready to be implemented by force, if necessary.
Now, Klein says Chile involved three distinct forms of shock. We've got the military coup, that's one. The economic shock treatment, that's two. What was the third shock? This is where it gets really dark, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes.
The third shock, according to Klein, was psychological. It involved using techniques derived from psychiatric research, specifically Dr. Ewan Cameron's work on shock, drugs, sensory deprivation, techniques that were actually codified into torture methods in the CIA's Kubark manual.
Torture methods derived from psychiatric research.
Yes, and these methods were then taught through CIA programs to police and military across Latin America. Klein makes this chilling connection. She calls torture the silent partner in the global free market crusade.
A silent partner, how so?
Well, she describes how things like sensory deprivation, sensory overload, stress positions, they're designed to induce a state of deep shock and disorientation in prisoners, to break their will, force compliance, get confessions.
So it's about breaking the individual, just like the economic shock aims to break the collective.
That's the parallel she draws. And she quotes this U.S. police trainer, Dan Mitrione, who horrifically insisted torture was not sadism, but science. His motto, the precise pain in the precise place in the precise amount.
That is truly disturbing. And the sources mentioned this wasn't just Chile. Argentina saw maybe 30,000 disappeared, thousands tortured across the region. So this orchestrated raid needed force.
It absolutely did. An Argentine journalist told Klein the economic policies were just extremely unpopular with most people. So it had to be implemented by force. It wasn't happening by consensus.
Klein also mentions the Ford Foundation funding human rights groups, but refusing to look into why the repression was happening.
Yes, a kind of willful blindness, she suggests. Not connecting the dots between the economic project and the violence needed to push it through. And this pattern wasn't isolated. She points to Indonesia in '65, too. The U.S. and Britain wanted President Sukarno out. The CIA apparently gave General Suharto lists of leftists. Suharto then launched this massive purge, killing hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million. An American official said, there's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment. Same logic.
Strike hard during a crisis. It seems like this doctrine was initially very much tied to dictatorships needing that level of force. But Klein says it expanded, right, into more democratic settings. How did that happen? What was the debt shock?
Right, it mutated. By the 1980s, many Latin American countries were drowning in debt, often debt run up by the previous military. This created a new vulnerability, the debt shock. Then the U.S. Fed chair, Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates up to 21% in the early 80s. This absolutely crippled developing countries trying to service their dollar-denominated debts. They were desperate.
Holding them hostage, essentially.
Effectively, yes. It created a new kind of crisis.
And this is where institutions like the IMF and the World Bank step in. Klein argues their role changed dramatically. They were meant to prevent shocks, weren't they?
That was the original idea, stability. But Klein argues that by this point, staffed with many Chicago school economists, they started seeing these debt crises not as problems to solve, but as, quote, precious opportunities to leverage for opening up new free market frontiers.
So they became the enforcers of the shock doctrine.
Pretty much. They'd offer bailouts, but the money came bundled with conditions, privatization, free trade, austerity. Countries in crisis had little choice but to accept the whole package.
Like in Argentina again.
Exactly. After the dictatorship, the Cavallo plan aimed to finish the job. By '94, they'd sold off 90% of state companies, fired around 700,000 workers. The finance minister, Cavallo, infamously called it major surgery without anesthetic.
Major surgery without anesthetic. That's a brutal description. How did this play out somewhere like Poland, supposedly moving towards democracy after communism?
Well, Poland in the early 90s was in deep crisis. 600% inflation, food shortages, classic shock conditions. Jeffrey Sachs, the Harvard economist, advised them to adopt shock therapy.
The same Jeffrey Sachs known for this approach?
The very same. He often pointed to Bolivia as his model success story. But Klein highlights that Lech Walesa, the Polish leader, famously said, I just don't want to see Bolivia here.
Why? What was the issue with Bolivia?
What Sachs often left out, Klein notes, was that Bolivia's shock therapy involved declaring a state of emergency, even kidnapping union leaders to stop protests. So Walesa saw the authoritarian edge needed to make it work.
And there was democracy avoidance in Poland, too.
Yes. Klein argues these highly controversial economic plans were rushed through, sort of smuggled in under the cover of general pro-democracy reforms before people could really debate or vote on the specifics. Speed it.
And China. A different context, but did they use a version of this?
China's interesting. Deng Xiaoping was already moving towards a market economy in the 80s, even invited Friedman over. But the pace accelerated dramatically after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. The protests were fueled by discontent over the economic changes, job losses, rising prices. Klein argues the government used the massacre, the shock of that crackdown, to basically silence dissent and then ram through its most sweeping reforms yet. It cleared the path for radical change, free from fear of rebellion.
Using internal shock to push an economic agenda. Okay, this brings us closer to home and to a huge global shock. September 11th, 2001. How does Klein argue the shock doctrine manifested in the U.S. after 9/11?
Klein makes a powerful claim here. She argues the Bush administration deliberately seized upon the fear generated by the attacks, not just for security, but to launch the war on terror as an almost completely for-profit venture.
For-profit?
Yes, a huge new industry. She calls it the disaster capitalism complex, and its ultimate goal, she suggests, was essentially the privatization of the government itself, outsourcing core functions.
Like what?
Things like healthcare for soldiers, interrogating prisoners, collecting intelligence data, even reconstruction overseas, handing over traditional state roles to private corporations.
And Dick Cheney and Halliburton play a big role in her analysis here, right?
A central role. While Cheney was VP, Halliburton, his former company, saw its role in military logistics explode. They provided entire infrastructures for the military, and crucially, their contracts were often cost-plus.
Meaning the more they spent, the more profit they made.
Exactly. Don't worry, it's cost-plus, became the saying. Klein points out Cheney's net worth soared. Halliburton's stock jumped 300% after the Iraq War started. She also details the revolving door key figures like Ashcroft, Ridge, Woolsey, moving from top government jobs straight into the booming homeland security industry. It became, in her view, a total merger of political and corporate power.
This merger seems key to her view of the Iraq War. She calls it the formula re-emerging with far greater violence. Unpack that for us.
Iraq, for Klein, is the ultimate, most brutal application. First, the military doctrine shock and awe, designed to overwhelm and psychologically dominate. Then immediately after the invasion, while the country was chaotic, L. Paul Bremer, the U.S. envoy, imposed the full economic shock therapy package.
Right in the middle of the chaos.
Exactly. Mass privatization of Iraqi industries, total free trade, slashing the government workforce. Iraqi officials reportedly said they were sick and tired of being the subjects of experiments. It was imposed top-down at lightning speed.
What were the results of that rapid privatization on the ground for Iraqis?
Catastrophic, according to Klein. Bremer fired 400,000 Iraqi soldiers. Many then joined the insurgency. The dismantling of the state removed skilled people and weakened secular institutions, creating instability. And the corporate reconstruction, often a disaster. She cites Parsons getting $186 million for 142 health clinics. They finished only 6. Corruption was rampant. Klein argues this wasn't just mismanagement, it was almost policy. Iraq was treated as a Wild West capitalism frontier, liberated from laws, ripe for exploitation.
And the torture, that third shock from Chile. Did Klein see echoes in Iraq?
Direct echoes, tragically. When Iraqis resisted, they faced, as Klein puts it, distinctly less metaphorical shocks. She documents sensory deprivation, drugging, freezing water, dogs, beatings, electrocution, using tools like the Picanaprod, used by both U.S. forces and the new Iraqi police they trained.
The same patterns repeating.
Yes. Her conclusion on Iraq is devastating. She said something more monstrous has happened, the erasure of an entire country. Iraq is disappearing, disintegrating. The ultimate outcome, she argues, of applying this doctrine with such force.
It's clear Klein sees this pattern far beyond just wars, natural disasters too. How did the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka fit her thesis?
Right, it's not just conflict zones. After the tsunami, there was this huge global aid response, $13 billion. But Klein details how the Sri Lankan government used the disaster to implement a buffer zone policy along the coast, ostensibly for safety. But it effectively cleared prime beachfront land, occupied for generations by fishing communities. Then came plans like the Arugam Bay Resource Development Plan to level the area and rebuild it as a high-end boutique tourism destination.
Using aid money meant for victims.
That's her claim. Aid money raised in the name of the victims facilitated the displacement of those same victims for luxury development. A local quoted by Klein called it victimizing the victims, exploiting the exploited. It fits her pattern of finding new profit frontiers, even amidst human tragedy.
And sometimes it seems the crisis doesn't even need to be that catastrophic. Klein suggests crises can be manufactured or exaggerated.
Exactly. She talks about useful crises. In Canada, she argues a deficit problem was hyped up by think tanks funded by banks to justify deep cuts to social programs that were otherwise unpopular.
Creating the narrative to fit the policy.
Precisely. Or in Ontario, an education minister actually spoke about creating a useful crisis to push through unpopular education reforms. And perhaps most shockingly, she cites a former IMF staffer, Davison Boudhou, who accused the IMF of deliberately cooking the books, falsifying data to make Trinidad and Tobago's economy look worse than it was.
Why would they do that?
To force them into accepting an IMF bailout, which came with the standard deadliest medicine of shock therapy, layoffs, wage cuts, privatization. It suggests a deliberate strategy of creating the conditions for shock, not just responding to them.
Okay, this is a pretty bleak picture Klein paints. With this doctrine seemingly so pervasive, has there been any pushback, any successful resistance, or people becoming shock resistant?
Yes, and this is a crucial part of the book's later sections. Klein does see growing shock resistance. She points strongly to Latin America, where she says the state of shock had finally worn off.
How so?
You see countries like Ecuador under Correa openly rejecting Friedman's ideas, nationalizing resources, Bolivia under Morales nationalizing mining, Argentina, Brazil, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all moving away from IMF deals. Argentina's president famously declared, "There is life after the IMF, and it's a good life."
That's a huge shift.
Massive. Latin America went from representing 80% of the IMF's loan portfolio down to just 1% in only 2 years. That's concrete resistance at a national level.
Are there other kinds of resistance she highlights, maybe more grassroots?
Definitely. In Lebanon, after the 2006 war, she describes the first national revolt specifically targeting post-war disaster capitalism, people protesting reconstruction plans that only benefited elites. In Spain, after the Madrid train bombings, voters rejected the government that backed the Iraq War, drawing on collective memory of dictatorship to resist being manipulated by fear. And in New Orleans, after Katrina,
What happened there?
residents started physically re-invading public housing projects the government wanted to demolish for redevelopment, literally taking back their homes, rebuilding themselves, in spite of the government.
People's reconstruction, as she calls it. That sounds like the direct opposite of disaster capitalism.
It is. Klein describes it as improvisational, using scrap and rubble, not aiming for that destructive, clean slate the shock doctrine often requires, but focusing on repair, resilience, community-led efforts. It reflects a different worldview that economics shouldn't just serve the few and that communities can rebuild on their own terms.
And yet Klein ends by reminding us of the stark reality this doctrine has produced: massive global inequality. The richest 2% owning over half the world's wealth, CEOs earning over 400 times the average worker in the U.S.
It's a sobering backdrop. The consequences are real and measurable. But Klein's ultimate point, I think, is that understanding the playbook, understanding the shock doctrine itself, is the first step towards countering it. When people see the pattern, how crises are used, how policies are rushed through, they become harder to manipulate, harder to shock. That knowledge builds resilience. It shows that the shock doctrine isn't inevitable, that other choices are possible.
So maybe something for you, our listener, to think about as you go about your day. Where might you see echoes of this disaster capitalism dynamic playing out, maybe in how a local issue is framed or how solutions to problems are proposed? And what role could understanding these mechanisms and perhaps community awareness and action play in building something different, something more resilient and equitable where you are?